Good evening, welcome. I'm Hirsch Perlman, professor and chair of the UCLA Department of Art. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce tonight's speaker, Betye Saar. Betye Saar is one of the great assemblagists of contemporary art. Yeah, hear, hear. Her work has been the subject of solo exhibitions at the Studio Museum in Harlem, New York, San Francisco Museum of Art, the Whitney Museum of American Art, and the Santa Monica Museum of Art. Major group exhibitions include Now Dig This, Art and Black Los Angeles 1960 to 1980 at the Hammer Museum here, traveled to MoMA PS1 and Williams College Museum of Art in Williamstown. Also Pacific Standard Time, Cross Currents in LA Painting and Sculpture, 1945 to 1970 at the Getty Museum, and WAC, Art and the Feminist Revolution, 1965 to 1980 at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles. Betty's work is found in the permanent collections of over 60 museums, including the Museum of Modern Art, New York, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the Whitney Museum of American Art, and the Smithsonian American Art Museum in DC, of course. In an interview with NPR in 2006, Betty said that, of course, she recycles materials, but she is really recycling emotions. And ultimately, her work assembles stories, rich and difficult historical allegories that are always stirring, sometimes mournful, even macabre, intrepid, and funny at the same time. Please join me in welcoming Betye Saar.
Black Girl's Window, an assemblage I created in 1969, 5 decades ago. My talk tonight will be how I reinterpret my work from that period. In Black Girl's Window, my mystic self is pressing against the glass, the window of the unknown. The panes above depict the area of my destiny, my astrological sign, which is Leo, and the planet is my sun. My unknown ancestors, my heritage, my past. The eagle represents my country and my politics, my family, death, and a phonology chart. The sky, the phases of the moon from dawn to twilight. The sun. Here I am on my 88th resolution. On my 88th revolution around the sun. My family, the core of my being. And me, the rainbow babe in the woods. Then death, the alpha, the omega, the beginning and the end. Death left its imprint on me at an early age. The death of my father cast a shadow of mystery. A mystery of death and rebirth. But later, that shadow became an inspiration, and my art allowed me to express my grief. Years later, the death of my great-aunt Hattie reminded me of the fragility of life. When I acquired her mementos, her hankies, her gloves, her letters, her photos, all the things that she had saved from her life, I began to recycle them and create collages and assemblages. The other death which affected me was the murder of Martin Luther King, of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., which triggered a rage within me, and the mystic transformed into the warrior. I recycled a passive mammy. I recycled this mammy into a gun-toting warrior. With the creation of the liberation of Aunt Jemima, I became part of the women's movement and the Black civil rights movement. I recycled Black derogatory images, the residue of slavery, to fight racism. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the civil rights movement. But unfortunately, racism, subtle and slimy as it is still here, and racism enslaves us all. The phrenology chart symbolizes my mind, my thoughts, my dreams, my ideas, fantasies, imagination, inspiration, and the seeds of my creativity. My studio in 1975. I became a hunter and a gatherer, accumulator of objects, images, things, and stuff. I collect and recycle chairs, clocks, tables, shelves, globes, photos, fabrics, papers, etc., to combine the ordinary with the beautiful. Nothing is thrown away. In my 80s, I began to examine my art process. I love making objects. But objects can only be exhibited, and that wasn't enough for me. I began to feel like a manufacturer. I wanted to create art that enabled me to express something to the viewer, so the viewer can kind of get a hint of how I felt when I created it. That's good. So I began a series of work with cages. The destiny of latitude and longitude was about my ancestral past, about the Middle Passage from Africa to America. The cage became a memory vessel, which conceals, which reveals. Installation art seemed to answer the question of what I really wanted to say with my art, and I became interested in it as a way to fill the space with objects, the objects that I would create, to surround the viewer, to create a mood. Secrets and Revelations. In 2012, was an installation which was part of the Pacific Standard Time, their series of exhibitions. This installation was first designed for the Studio Museum in Harlem in 1980, and so I reorganized it and reinstalled it for the Pacific Standard Time at MoCA. Sometimes the color inspires me, and for a while the color red began to tease me. Red indicating danger, violence, heat, passion, blood, and fire. Red Time, a detail of the Crimson Captive. I created an installation, a mini retrospect, using red objects that I had fabricated, that I had found, that I had borrowed, that I had recycled, dating from the 1960s to 2011. These items were exhibited in a room where the walls were painted red. Inside this room, the viewer could sit and be reflected as the color red and become part of red time. In 2013, I collected materials with the color of the sky and of water and created the alpha and the omega, the beginning and the end. The alpha, the omega, the beginning and the end. The moon passes through its phases, waxing, waning, the nights, the months, the years. The new moon begins with the cradle of dreams. The cradle of dreams filled with hopes, the promises and visions of the future. The destiny is shaped by the challenge of fate. The past, our ancestors, our history, who we were, who we will be. The mystic window of sky and sea, the moon above, the sea below, to remind us that we are surrounded and connected to nature with all its beauty and all its mystery. Our lives are filled with objects, obsessions, obligations. The confines of materials, of things, of ideas, emotions, of culture and society, all the stuff we accumulate. The game of time is played week by week, hour by hour, day by day. The sands of time are always shifting, drifting, as years become decades, and time sends us on the journey to elsewhere, to the dark side of the moon. There are many ways to make art, and there are many reasons to make art, and I have shown you some of mine. Currently, my strongest inspiration comes from a quote that I read about 12 years ago. It was written by a French poet and philosopher named Michel Leiris in 1937. And that quote is, "Everything we love is going to die. That is why now it is important that everything we love be summed up into something unforgettably beautiful, like the shedding of so many tears of farewell." That's only an hour. Thank you.
So I have a question about motherhood and how motherhood has shaped your art practice. If you could talk about that from, it's me,
You have to
Jill.
tell me what you
If you
said.
could talk about the change in your art practice from when your children were small and then watching them grow and to now being independent again, and how that has affected
She's still talking.
both your practice and your subject matter.
She wants to know how motherhood has affected your practice.
My husband and I were both artists, so art was always part of our household. I am an alumni of UCLA, and I was trained in design. So at first, I was a designer of interiors, fashion, theater, things like that, but moved into printmaking when I went to get my graduate degree, and that was at Long Beach. I had a press at home, and we always made art. We just always, my kids grew up, my children grew up, my 3 daughters grew up making art and going to galleries and being part of art. My career was slow to start because When you have youngsters at home, you don't have too much time. But after they got established in school, and now especially when they're all out and married, then I have full time to make art. It's not easy, to do that. I had to travel around, giving talks, giving lectures, teaching, and but children come first. And I think that kind of a pace sort of let me relax. I didn't have a very fierce competitive spirit, but when I had time to work, a lot was completed during that time.
So I'd like to know, what was it like being a black female on UCLA's campus in the 50s?
What was it like being a black female at UCLA when you attended?
UCLA was very, very different at that time. Lots of dirt, was not landscaped. There was a ravine. There was a wonderful sort of park-like botanical garden here. The art building was now, I think it's a student union building. I think it was maybe a couple of floors, not that many classes. But there was an art community because we weren't that many here. However, during my senior year, the student body president was a young black student named Cheryl Luke. And I don't know, because we kind of stuck together, I didn't particularly receive any kind of racism. I enjoyed my classes. And most of the black students knew each other, and I can't tell you how many were, but it was okay. It was fun. It was good. It was small, intimate, and a good campus, a good place to be from.
You talked about racism still being here and it still enslaves us all. If you redid Aunt Jemima as a revolution, what would she look like today?
Well, the purpose of doing Aunt Jemima was because she was made from a derogatory black image, which was much more prevalent at that time. And for me, that became my particular way of dealing with racism. I couldn't join any of the movements that went down south because I had to stay home with my kids. So what would she look like now? I have no idea, because I just used a derogatory image that was available.
Not so much just her image, but because racism today, what's happened to your aunts, your anger?
She wants to know if you still have an angst towards racism, an anger towards racism.
Yes. Yes. I know you've heard about a person named Zimmerman. Well, it was flared up there again. There are all sorts of incidents that keep that going. The recent movie, 12 Years a Slave, that shows like what it was, and it's still very subtle, but it is the same feelings, It's very hard for me to see films like that because in many places, it's just very sad.
Which African American artists have you had the pleasure of working with, like Samela Lewis or Elizabeth Catlett or Jacob Lawrence or Charles White? Or
A show that started in South Carolina called Legacies, Family Legacies, with Allison and Leslie and myself, and it toured around here. It went to the Pasadena Museum, if you happen to see that. And we collaborated on a piece together. We've shown together many times, but we collaborated on a piece when Betye Saar passed, and we did a collaboration in honor of him. And then we did something else at the Barnsdale when Josine Starles was there, when she had a holiday show called the Magical Mystery Tour. We collaborated on a piece like that. I tend to be a loner, so I haven't really collaborated with many artists.
Betye, can you tell the people about how much art you're still creating and still producing each week, and your creative schedule?
She wants you to talk about all the work you're making every week and all the work you're working on right now currently.
You mean work that I'm currently working on?
Yes, Betye, it's Angela.
Well, you saw a photograph of my studio. Bring my studio up. It's stuffed full of things. And because of my age, I know that I will never use up all the stuff in my studio. So I just kind of walk around and start putting things together, and that's kind of the process of where it goes. And it continues like that until something clicks and things seem to fit together. So in the foreground of this picture, you see some chairs, not chairs, but stools and a clock and things. So I'm stacking things up. Then in an early morning dream, I thought about washboards because I had done a series on washboards. And I went around my studio and got all the washboards that I have leftovers. I always have leftovers from my series, and put them on a table. And then I start putting things on top of that. And that's the way my creative process seems to work. And then sometimes I pick up a photograph and work with a picture or fabrics or something like that. But it's always going in one direction or another. But I take a lot of time in collecting things and putting things together until the piece sort of dictates what it's going to be, and then I concentrate on doing that. So that's what I'm doing right now. My table is covered with about 10 washboards with different objects on them.
Hi. We live in Laurel Canyon, and wondering if you could tell about if
lamp?
Laurel Canyon inspired you at all, and also about printmaking, how you got into printmaking, and anything about your process.
Before I moved to Laurel Canyon, I lived in the South Bay. I lived in in Hermosa Beach, and I was a printmaker. When I went back to school to work on my master's, I was seduced by printmaking and loved making prints. And then when I moved to Laurel Canyon, I bought a press and was doing that. The effect of Laurel Canyon is that it's really close to nature. When I moved there in 61, there had been a fire in 59, so it was pretty desolate. It was like burnt branches and dirt, and maybe 3 homes that had survived the fire and maybe 3 more that were being constructed. But I've always felt very comfortable there. It's hilly, it's not a view, it's not a glamorous kind of place. It was old country houses that were there, and it was a nice experience for me to do. And the printmaking thing, I have the feeling that I want to go back to it. And I've had some experiences in making printmaking, but I've always been a guest at a printmaking facility. But now it's just a matter of time.
I just want to thank you so much for coming out tonight. It's been a real treat listening to you talk about your work. My question is, will art save us? And is that an ethic that, no, I mean, people are laughing, but it's a belief of mine, and I wonder if the idea that art can save inspires you at all.
I have been rescued by art. So, I think everyone who has had a creative experience, whether it's through arts or dance or poetry or any of the other ways, any way they can find someone, even things like cooking or sewing or things that seem sort of mundane. If there's a creative thing that you can express either through your garden or whatever, that feeds your own personal spirit or your own personal soul and gives you a way to interpret something on the outside through an inner process. And that way, art is saved by individuals on an individual level. The recent article in Time, I guess maybe it was like around Thanksgiving, was talking about creativity and longevity, and how the people who were creative seem to have a longer life and maybe a more satisfying life. And it gave a couple of examples. It gave an example of a woman whose husband was a painter, but she was a nurse. And then he died, and then she retired, and she went into her studio and started painting, not like he did, but making art, and how satisfying that was for her. Another thing the article pointed out was that if you have a creative tendency, that it doesn't always express itself the way that maybe you learned your living. That a person, and they gave this example, a person who was a poet, maybe couldn't write anymore, couldn't think of words anymore, became a painter. So I think the thing is not so much art, but the creative process or the creative part of us all. And there is two examples of how art saved someone. This still is on an individual level. A friend of mine who was a musician, an actress, and a writer became ill, and her illness was not known, so she required a lot of information from clinics and so forth. And she had collected an early peace of mind, and she sold it, and that enabled her to find medical help. And another one, a friend of mine, I had traded him a piece of art, and he gave my art to his son, and his son had a toothache, and he went to the dentist, and in the examination, he discovered that it's more than a toothache, it was cancer. And so he sold that piece and got medical care. So art can save people.
Where is your absolute most favorite place to go picking for your things?
What did he
That's a
say?
good question. He wants to know what your favorite place is to get all of your materials.
Oh, to get all my materials. Well, I have so many now I can't think of it, but I always like thrift stores and antique malls. I like to go to different places to travel around and find things. I like to walk on the railroad track and look down and see them. If people are embarrassed to be with me when I'm walking, I said, I'm going to walk back here and look down because I can find something and make something out of it. Currently, I've been going to the Pasadena City College flea market, but now I have so much stuff, it's just not there. It's just now the challenge is for me to use it up. So.
I wanted to ask, along with the African American culture, there's a lot of other cultures that are also repressed. So I wanted to ask if you can give us any kind of like advice as an artist who already went through a lot of stuff, of how to deal with that kind of repression among the society.
She wants to know if you have any advice for other people of ethnic minorities that are artists today dealing with racism.
Racism.
Yeah, if you have advice.
You mean through the art?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, art is a terrific therapist, you know, and I think if you're true to yourself, if you are seeking your own authenticity, then you have to be true to what you are in every area. You know, whether it's race or gender or whatever, you have to be true to yourself. And I think art can help you do that. And the more you concentrate on that and being true to making art or music or whatever to be meaningful to you, rather than what the market pays or what was currently favorable or the competition of art, then you only become a stronger person, and by that, maybe a happier person. And if that's the goal, then that's one way of trying to get there.
Do you?
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much.